Hello and welcome back. Once again, I'm your instructor, Lukas, and today we'll be looking at the various patterns of development, sometimes known as rhetorical patterns, drawn from Chapter 8, Patterns of Development, in the textbook I wrote, College Composition and Reading, Information and Strategies, which is linked in the description box below. These 8 patterns of development, description, narration, exemplification, comparison and contrast, classification and division, cause and effect, definition, and process analysis are basically ways of thinking or methods of communication. Each of them suggests a type of support that you can use in a paragraph. You already use all of these patterns in your lives, as the textbook points out, since we are all thinking, communicating beings. We'll go over each of the patterns in detail in this video. In essence, in this class, we focus on patterns of development in 2 ways: as a method for brainstorming and coming up with supporting ideas for your writing in the first place, and as methods for revision, adding material and/or shaping your use of the patterns for maximum efficiency. Because while we do use them unconsciously all the time, if we are conscious of what we're doing, we can be more artful and effective in how we do it. With no further ado, let's begin with the first pattern, description. Description is using words to create a mental image and is a pattern often used in conjunction with others. Helping your reader create a mental image can lend power to your writing by making it more lifelike and vivid, by drawing the reader in and engaging their interest and emotions, and by influencing the reader's perception of the object being described. In using description well, you basically need to be able to do 3 things. Observe the thing being described. Obviously, you can't describe it if you're not familiar with it. However, more important is selecting relevant details and describing them well and having the details fit together coherently. How do you know which details are the most important to include? By considering your dominant impression. Your dominant impression is the aspect of your description that you're trying to emphasize, although it's not necessarily the most obvious or stereotypically important aspect. In the textbook, I give the following example about various ways you might describe your grandparents' house. To emphasize how old and worn it was, you could describe the sagging porch, the musty smells, and the sound of the wind whistling through the windows and cracks during a storm. To emphasize how much fun you had there, you could describe the big box of toys in the living room, the deliciousness of the meals you ate at the table, the feeling of the banister as you slid down it. To emphasize how historic it was, you might discuss the architect who designed it and describe unique features or remnants from the past, like a giant backyard, an old telephone that was being rented from the telephone company, narrow staircases, or the outhouse out back. Basically, you need to keep your purpose in mind and be selective about only including details that help you achieve that purpose. This relates to selection, slanting, and charged language that we discussed in Chapter 5. Basically, the most effective descriptions use selection of facts and charged language, language with connotations, to create the desired effect in the reader. However, balance is important. You don't want so many details that your reader's overwhelmed or confused about the point, but you don't want so few that your description is ineffective either. There are many different detail types, a few of which are listed here, but I want to emphasize 2 in particular: abstract versus concrete. Abstract language is conceptual and is often based on ideas or concepts rather than facts. Abstract words give the readers a general impression, whereas concrete words, specific, descriptive words, help the reader grasp the particulars. It's often useful to start with a more abstract description, for example, saying the dress is beautiful, and then follow with concrete information, for instance, details about the color, fabric, fit, and so on. Finally, one good way to make your descriptions more vivid, engaging, and effective is to make sure that you are using more than just one of the senses. People naturally gravitate towards sight, describing how something looks, But if you want your reader to really get involved, you don't want to make them feel like they're looking at it through bulletproof glass. You want to make them feel like they are right there. This means using several, if not all, of the 5 senses: sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch, which can be any physical sensations. To see how this works, let's examine the example description given in the textbook. I had a good dinner. Notice how vague and general this description is. Good is a very abstract term. As I mentioned earlier, it can be useful to start with an abstract term to give your reader a general idea or impression, but you should follow it up with concrete detail to show what you mean. Let's look at a description with more concrete, specific detail. I had a delicious dinner of spaghetti with hot, steaming, spicy red sauce, filled with soft, juicy meatballs, and topped with just the right amount of tangy Parmesan cheese. The smell of the sauce reminded me of an Italian restaurant with red and white checkered tablecloths over wooden tables, quiet violin music, and flickering candlelight. The chewy, sweet French bread, lavished with butter, complemented the spaghetti perfectly, cooling my mouth and clearing it for the next bite of garlicky sauce. Where do we see the senses being used here? And it's obvious how much more interesting and persuasive this is. It really was a good dinner. One way you can try to create more vivid descriptions is by replacing your verbs and nouns with more specific ones and adding adjectives and adverbs. For example, if you wrote, "The tree moved in the wind," you could replace tree with a more specific word, what kind of tree, and add description words. Was it young, old, slender, gnarled, tall? You could replace moved with a more specific action. Did it bend, shake, vibrate, dance? And you could describe the wind. Was it gusty, violent, gentle, harsh? Did it smell a certain way? I encourage you to take a moment to practice what you've just learned and pause the video to write a description of a relaxing place. Your dominant impression is relaxation. Remember to be specific and use several senses, not just sight. One of the most common ways description is used is as part of a story or narration, illustrating how these categories can often overlap in actual usage. As with the other patterns, the primary focus in narration is to make sure that you have a purpose in telling the story and to make your choices of selection, sequencing, etc. with that purpose in mind. Humans are storytelling creatures, and telling stories comes naturally to us. That makes it easy to get carried away with telling the story, including all kinds of details just because they happened and not because they're relevant. If any of you has ever heard a story told by a 5-year-old, you know why this isn't the best way to go. Your reader is bored and confused before you ever get to the part that was why you were telling the story in the first place. My mother is also guilty of this. She'll say, "I ran into so-and-so at the store today. You know, Sam's mother. Did you hear about his new job? She's so proud. Anyway, I saw her today. Oh, and she was wearing the cutest outfit." And on and on. And 10 minutes later, it finally comes to light that the point was that the woman suggested a new dish to try for dinner that we're having tonight. So again, it comes back to being concise and focused, especially when using narration in an essay. It's merely supposed to be the I or information of the paragraph, so the story shouldn't even be a full paragraph long. Some other tips that can help your narrations to be more effective include making sure that people are lifelike and clear. You also want to use the lessons of slanting through selection of facts and charged language to make sure that your readers get out of your story what you want them to. You aren't expressing everything that happened. You're shaping the story and the experience to emphasize a particular aspect, what the story is supporting or proving. For example, when describing a bad day, you'll linger over your description of the negative things that happened using heavily negative word and lots of description, but you will likely not mention any good events at all, like if you found a quarter on the street. Your use of language can be very important as well. Just as with description, you often want to include several of the senses to draw the reader into the story. And select your verbs carefully. Also, you want to make sure the progression of the story is clear, using transitions and making sure readers know what order the events happened in, usually by sticking to chronological order. You also need a clear introduction so that the reader knows why the story is being told. Often, the topic sentence in the paragraph will serve this purpose. The most common type of narrative that would be used in an academic essay is the anecdote, a short, direct story, rather than a more extended retelling. Remember, keep it short and focused. The point is not to tell everything, but to prove your point or otherwise accomplish your purpose. Again, the main idea to keep in mind is to stay focused on the purpose you're trying to achieve by telling the story. Include details that help that purpose or are needed for understanding, and leave out any that don't help the story accomplish the purpose. Stories often serve as examples of particular points, illustrating and supporting the claim, again showing the overlap between categories in actual usage. You might use description in a narrative that is acting as an example. Examples are one of my favorite patterns because they're easy and effective. Nothing helps a reader understand more than an example, which is one reason that I have so many. For example, and notice how I'm using examples right now and how much it helps you. For example, the three strikes law has produced some extreme cases of injustice. For example, one man was sentenced to 25 years to life for stealing a $9 video because he had 2 prior convictions from 30 years previous. This passage is from a student's research essay and shows how compelling an example can be. One reason they're so helpful is because they make things that are general or abstract concrete. Remember in description that I encouraged you to begin with abstract or general information and then get more specific with concrete details? Well, an example is a great way to do this, as is shown above. Examples are extremely effective, not only because they make things concrete and easy to imagine, but well-used examples help keep the reader interested and clarifies for easy understanding. Make sure to tailor your examples to your audience. A good example that the reader can relate to is an excellent way to connect to your audience, like I used an example from a research essay on this slide for my class full of college English students. Now, when people think of examples, they tend to think of actual, real examples that have happened to them. However, this is far from the only type. There are many places to get real examples, a few of which are listed here on the slide, such as online. Not only do examples not have to be something that happened to you personally, they don't even have to be something that happened at all. An important and effective tool that you shouldn't overlook is hypothetical examples. While they aren't real, they are realistic. A hypothetical example is something people could easily imagine happening in real life. While they don't pack quite the punch of an actual example from real life, hypothetical examples have the advantage that you can choose and shape them as you please. For example, see how I'm still using it? For an essay arguing for same-sex marriage, I might say, imagine if one member of a couple who's been together for over 20 years falls ill and is hospitalized. Without legal same-sex marriage, their partner wouldn't be considered family and would not be allowed in to see them. The person could die without having a chance to say goodbye to their life partner. Notice that I didn't try to fake like it was a real story, making up names. It's clear that it's a hypothetical example, and yet it gives a compelling reason why my argument should be heeded. Metaphors and similes, comparisons using like or as or not, can also be powerful tools, since as we've already learned, our brains work by making connections. Saying something like, that man was a total pig, or my husband's a real teddy bear, gives others a mental picture as well as an overall idea of the qualities of the people you're discussing. Romeo says, Juliet is my sun and moon and stars, letting us know how important she is to him. She is all of the sources of natural light in his world, and without her it would be cold and dark. Using like or as turns the comparison from a metaphor into a simile and can also impart additional impact on what you're saying. If you say that you're cold, that's one thing, but to say that you feel as cold as an icicle in Antarctica feels much more impactful and gives your reader something to imagine that makes them really feel that cold. There's a reason that so many sayings that have been around long enough to turn into cliches are similes, such as drop like a rock, and that's because they are effective. We'll talk more about these when we discuss comparison and contrast. However, with any use of exemplification, you also want to keep your audience in mind, thinking about which examples would be the most familiar, clear, and convincing to them. Remember to stay focused on the point and be selective about what details to include. I didn't mention what disease the same-sex partner was suffering from because it doesn't matter to my point, the potential unfairness and inhumanity inherent in denying two people the right to a government-sanctioned union. Watch out. Perhaps the greatest trap in writing is that your means don't lead to an end. What you end up with is a string of examples that don't lead anywhere. All your examples can be thoroughly developed, but if they're not supporting an assertion or an argument, then they're not connected to the thesis, and you need to make some changes. Again, the patterns can be used to make essays longer and stronger, and adding examples is an easy and excellent way to do this, as long as the examples are 1. Specific, 2. Relevant, supporting a point clearly, and 3. Striking, interesting, surprising, funny, etc. Now you have a chance to do an activity practicing what you've just learned. I encourage you to pause the video and write a pie paragraph with an example as the I or information section and one of the following as a topic sentence. Either you can learn many valuable life skills in college, or television offers some programs with educational value and good lessons. Comparison is an extremely strong tool since, as we've discussed before, the brain works via connections. We learn and understand by connecting to things that are familiar to us, so making an explicit connection or comparison to a more familiar or concrete concept can be extremely helpful. For example, look, there's examples again. When discussing abstract or unfamiliar concepts, teachers often rely on analogies, which are a type of comparison. For instance, professors discussing the behavior of electricity often liken it to water, since they have many similarities, and we are all familiar with the behavior of water. Comparing and contrasting two things helps us to understand them both better, and is commonly used to help us make decisions. This facet can be used in essays as well. For example, comparing the policies proposed by one political candidate to those proposed by the other, and possibly comparing their probable effects, might persuade a reader to vote for the candidate you favor. There are a few things to keep in mind when writing comparisons. One is that you cannot compare two things unless they have something in common. In order to stay focused, you should have a basis for comparison, a fairly broad, common characteristic that you can focus on. This basis should relate to your purpose for the comparison. Within that basis of comparison, you'll want to develop your comparison by finding points of comparison, specific points or elements within that broad characteristic. You should avoid stating the obvious just because it is a comparison. Only mention characteristics that matter to the point you're trying to make. It's also important to use clear transitions so that your reader doesn't get confused about which of the two things being compared that you're currently discussing. There are some classes and situations where you might write an entire essay or other expository work that is only a comparison. If you're planning to use comparison and contrast as the basis of a thesis statement or topic sentence, it will likely be one of the following: that one is better or worse than the other, which is the most common type. You might also argue that they seem very different, but are actually quite similar, or that they seem very similar, but are actually quite different. Or, another common one, that their differences and similarities show something important, useful, or significant. You'll have the option to write this type of essay later in the semester on the Da Vinci Code, comparing a pair of characters. One of the most common uses of comparison is through an analogy. Again, comparison and contrast can be used to emphasize a point, illustrate an idea, or make something abstract concrete. Let's look at an example to see how this works. An example given by blogger Kathy Hadley stated that a psychologist teaching stress management raised a partially filled glass of water. Many people expected they would be asked the half-empty or half-full question, but she actually asked how heavy the glass of water was. People called out various guesses about the weight. She replied, "The absolute weight doesn't matter. It depends on how long I hold it. If I hold it for a minute, it's not a problem. If I hold it for an hour, I'll have an ache in my arm. If I hold it for a day, my arm will feel numb and paralyzed. In each case, the weight of the glass doesn't change, but the longer I hold it, the heavier it becomes. The stresses and worries in life are like that glass of water. Think about them for a little while, and nothing happens. Think about them a bit longer, and they begin to hurt. Think about them all day long, and you'll feel paralyzed, unable to do anything." She then talked about the need to let go of your stressors. She said, "As early in the evening as you can, put your burdens down. Don't carry them throughout the evening and all night. Remember to put the glass down." By comparing stress to a glass of water, the speaker makes a real impression and helps to make an abstract idea concrete. In fact, many motivational speakers who are addressing abstractions such as stress, love, or bullying will make analogies because they are so powerful. Motivational speaker Travis Brown uses comparisons as well. At one point during his speech, he takes out a $100 bill and asks if people want it, and they do. Then he crumples it up and stomps on it. Then he asks the crowd if they still want it, which is answered with a resounding yes. It was a demonstration of how things, and more importantly, people, have value, even if they've undergone trials or aren't picture perfect. In another example, a couple were arguing about custody. The woman said that since she gave birth to the child, she should have custody. The father asks the judge, "When you put a coin in a soda machine, does the soda belong to you or to the machine?" While his logic is faulty, his analogy can make his position seem much more reasonable to someone who doesn't think critically. One last example is a quote by Go Nasu. "An entire sea of water can't sink a ship unless it gets inside the ship. Similarly, the negativity of the world can't pull you down unless you allow it to get inside of you." This is much more effective and powerful than just saying, "Don't let it get to you." There are actually many ways you can use analogies in essays. For instance, in an essay about gay marriage, you could compare the current treatment of homosexuals with the past treatment of people of color or other minorities, or the gay marriage debate with the attitudes towards biracial marriage 50 years ago. Comparing discrimination based on sexual orientation to racism is a powerful comparison and argument for the inherent immorality of that discrimination. You could also contrast how homosexual and heterosexual couples are treated, or how married and unmarried couples are treated, or contrast the stated aims of the United States, like freedom for all and the idea that we're a melting pot, with the current discriminatory behavior. So then, when comparing, think about the aspect that you want to emphasize and think what embodies that. Don't think only of obvious comparisons. The glass of water is not obvious at all. If you want to say that something was embarrassing, say, "I felt like I was making a speech in front of my crush with drool running down my chin and my pants falling down." Again, comparisons are very powerful because of the ways that our brains work, through association. This image, with all the different aspects of being embarrassed, a speech, your crush, drool, being pantsed, really hammers home the impression of mortifying embarrassment. One final point about comparison is how you arrange it. There are two basic methods. One method is block organization, where you state all the qualities or characteristics of one, and then switch and discuss the characteristics of the other. This can be a useful method if you don't have very much to say, just one or two relevant characteristics for each. However, it should be avoided in longer comparisons, since it basically makes the reader do the work of making the actual comparison themselves, since you're essentially providing a list of characteristics, and the fact that the matching characteristics of the two topics aren't discussed together makes it more of an effort to see how they differ or how they align. In the case of longer comparisons, it's better to do a point-by-point comparison. For example, if you were comparing attending a four-year college versus beginning at a community college, you would compare their pricing directly. You might talk about the quality of education for one, and then the quality of education for the other. You might talk about the cost of living at a four-year versus attending community college in another paragraph. This way, each point of comparison is made clear, and the reader is directly shown how the same aspect in the two subjects compares to each other. Before we finish discussing comparison and contrast, let's take one more look at how comparison can be a powerful argument. This comic depicts a religious figure and a regular man discussing something, with the monk saying things like, "Your choice of lifestyle is an abomination," and the man saying things like, "But who am I hurting by being this way?" that make you think they're talking about homosexuality, but in the end it's revealed that they're discussing being left-handed. These days, everyone knows that being left-handed is a genetic trait that a minority of the population has, and it's both natural and harmless. This comic is arguing that being homosexual is also natural and harmless, and that it is just as ridiculous to object to it as it was to object to being left-handed. The analogy is even stronger because this really was the way that being left-handed was regarded hundreds of years ago. So then, what do all of these patterns of development have in common? What is an important focus no matter which pattern you're using for it to be effective? Focus on purpose and be selective. At this point, I encourage you to pause the video and go take a break of at least 10 minutes or so, since we're about halfway through a rather long video, having covered 4 of the 8 patterns. Take a break and come back to the video later today or even tomorrow to learn about the remaining 4 patterns of development. Welcome back. Hopefully you took a break as I suggested and have returned fresh and ready to move on to examining the other 4 patterns, which are less intuitive. Classification is an invaluable tool for understanding, and I use it constantly in this class. I've divided up the writing process, for example, into pre-writing, writing, and revision. And I divided pre-writing even further into brainstorming, organizing, and so on. This chapter itself is an excellent example. I've broken the ways of developing an argument into 8 categories, or classifications called patterns, in order to help you better understand each of them. Even though the classifications are somewhat artificial, as we've seen they often overlap, for instance when description is being used in a narrative example, it helps you to understand them better and thus to use them more effectively. The first point I'd like to make about classification is that there isn't a certain specific way that is the right way to classify a particular object or entity. There are myriad possibilities in anything. For example, while a library usually classifies books by genre, romance, sci-fi, biography, they could instead group the books by number of pages, by whether it has pictures, by the attention span needed, short, medium, long, or by how popular it is, which is one of the classifications used by Amazon, or by the educational level needed to understand the vocabulary and the references, each of which might be useful to different people in different situations. An excellent illustration of the infinite possibilities inherent in classification is the topic of animals. You could group them into wild animals, work animals, and pets, into ones that swim, run, or crawl, or herbivores, hunters, carrion eaters, as well as many other groupings. Each group of classifications has a principle of selection. There's a single aspect or element that determines how the animals are classified, by the degree of domesticity, by the method of movement, or by what they eat in the examples I just gave. For instance, if I said tigers or dogs, you would easily and immediately be able to place the animal in the correct category simply by considering the principle of selection. It's essential to have this consistent principle of division to keep the classification consistent. What we call things, or where we draw the line between one class and another, depends on the interests we have and the purposes of the classification. For example, animals are classified variously by the meat industry, the fur industry, the leather industry, zoologists, biologists, and hunters. None of these classifications are more correct or final than the others. Each is useful for its own purpose. However, for the classification to be useful, you must have that principle of selection. For example, here we go again, clarifying general or abstract ideas with exemplification. In a previous semester, one student chose to do the looking ahead question that asked you to classify types of friends and to describe each. His categories were female friends, animal friends, social friends, and dependable friends. While taken individually, each of these is indeed a type of friend. As a group, these classifications fall flat. Given a particular individual, I might be hard-pressed to figure out what category he or she was supposed to fit into. If I had a female friend who was very social, but was also someone I could count on, which category should I put her in? It's impossible to place her because she belongs in more than one category at the same time. An even more illuminating example was written by author Jorge Luis Borges, whose most famous work is The Garden of Forking Paths, and whose technique was the direct inspiration for Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. In one essay, he mentions, quote, a certain Chinese encyclopedia entitled Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge. On those remote pages it is written that animals are divided into A. Those that belong to the emperor, B. Embalmed ones, C. Those that are trained, D. Suckling pigs, E. Mermaids, F. Fabulous ones, G. Stray dogs, H. Those that are included in this classification, I. Those that tremble as if they were mad, J. Innumerable ones, K. Those drawn with a very fine camel's hair brush, L. Others, M. Those that have just broken a flower vase, N. Those that resemble flies from a distance. You can easily see that there are several problems with this list, mostly created by the lack of something in common they are being classified by, a principle of division. Again, you can't really use these categories effectively. Does a stray dog who breaks a vase belong in category G or M? What about mermaids belonging to the emperor? Also, the number of categories makes this more difficult to remember or use, in addition to how arbitrary they are. As I pointed out when we were talking about schema in an earlier chapter, things that seem arbitrary are difficult to remember, as the example with the funny man with the ring that squirts water and the short man with the broom to turn on the light showed. Make sure to avoid these problems. A professor of cognitive psychology at UC Berkeley named Eleanor Roche noted that, quote, the task of category systems is to provide the most amount of information with the least cognitive effort, end quote. And this example clearly fails miserably. However, this is not the only use that classification has, particularly in persuasive writing. As we've noted before, when you label something or put it in a particular category, there's an element of judgment as well. I once saw a Zitz cartoon where the mom is pulling her teenage son's clothes out of a laundry basket, sorting them into piles of dirty, disgusting, and horrifying. The son walks up and says, I liked it better when you sorted my clothes according to color. Why did he like it the other way? Because the new categories are less neutral and more negatively judgmental. How a culture chooses to classify can also be revealing and informative. For example, ancient peoples grouped time differently than we do in the modern world. A year consisted of the seasons of planting, growing, harvest, and the cold season. What does that show about their culture? You can tell what they think is important by how they choose to divide the year. In this case, this is clearly an agricultural people whose lives revolve around growing food. What about us? We are tradition-bound, even when we're unaware of the tradition. We divide time more finely than the ancients, down to milliseconds, showing our obsession with tracking, timeliness, and productivity. We're based largely off Greek and Roman traditions. For instance, Janus, the ancient god of doorways, with two faces looking forward and back, clearly has a connection with January. What about the fact that the Greeks and Romans named their months after gods? That shows how important and powerful they felt the gods were. They thought they avoided disaster by making the gods feel honored. And what is more honorable than having a month named after you? As another example, the Eskimo language has 40 different classification words for snow because it is important for them to divide it that finely. The type of snow makes an important difference. For us, just a few words or categories will do. The power of classification is also evidenced in the number of sayings that start out, "There are two types of people in the world." If a person says that there are two types of people, those who talk and those who listen, as I saw in a bumper sticker once, it's immediately clear which type of person is supposed to be the better one. Volkswagen, with its motto that the world is divided into drivers and passengers, is clearly trying to sway you towards one of those roles and into devaluing or deriding the other. How you define or label the groups makes a difference too, as you can see in the contrast between saying that the world is made up of neat freaks and normal people versus saying that it is made up of slobs and normal people. When we name something or label it, we are classifying. When one person kills another, is it an act of murder, an act of temporary insanity, an accident, or an act of heroism? As soon as the process of classification is completed, our attitudes and conduct are, to a considerable degree, determined. We punish the murderer, treat the insane, absolve the victim of circumstance, and pin a medal on the hero. As I mentioned in your textbook, many debates are ultimately problems of classification, like the abortion controversy, where foes classified the unborn entity as a baby and therefore define abortion as murder, whereas the advocates call that same unborn entity a fetus and part of the mother's body, giving her the right to make decisions about it. Classification determines our attitudes and behavior towards the object or event in question. Classification has several uses, some of which we've already been discussing. Classifications can be used to group and organize information, which leads to easier learning and memory. Classifying helps clarify the differences and similarities in the things being classified, and it can create a fresh, new way of viewing something. Finally, it can help explain things that aren't well understood by grouping them with similar things or breaking them down into their parts, as I am doing with providing support in this chapter by breaking it into 8 categories. An example that shows the power of classification is the case of Jeff Silverman, who worked in local children's shoe stores during high school and college, and he noticed there were 4 kinds of parents buying shoes for their toddlers. There were traditionalists who wanted unchanging shoes from reliable, established companies, well-known brands with a reputation for quality, even if the styles didn't change and they were a bit more expensive. There were economy-oriented parents for whom price was the most important factor. They see all shoes as basically the same, so how they classify affects their actions. There were also fashion-conscious parents who wanted their kids' shoes to be mini versions of their own shoes. Finally, the last type of parent he ran into he called attentive parents. These parents didn't just want a good fit, but also design and materials that were really right for baby play and learning how to walk. These well-informed, upscale shoppers were willing to pay a premium price if they found the right product. After he had identified these classifications of parents, Silverman realized there were companies with shoes aimed at all of the groups, except the attentive parents. So he made a business plan, got investors, and at 24 years old, he created a company that he named Toddler University. They started making high-quality shoes for little kids with more comfy rubber soles, longer lasting because they were stitched rather than glued, a big opening to get it on easily, and were measured by foot's length, width, and girth rather than just length alone. And they sold for a higher price of around $35 to $40 per pair. In 4 years, Silverman went from $100,000 in sales to $40 million in sales. Then he sold the company for a huge profit to one of the biggest firms in the footwear business, all because his classification showed him an untapped market. Nor is classification the only act that increases understanding. While division is often used as an aid to classification, it can also be a useful tool by itself. Using division can help people understand a whole. For instance, in order to realize why a wedding cake might cost $5,000, you must divide it into pieces. When you realize some of the divisions of that $5,000 cake include 192 eggs, 38 pounds of sugar, and 3 people working 135 hours, you understand better why it costs so much. I do this too. I'm teaching about writing, and I divide it into concepts like invention, revision, and paragraphing. I also divide within subjects, like when I divided invention into the different strategies, like research and brainstorming, and then further into types of brainstorming. As another example, I saw an internet meme with a picture of a scorpion with its tail raised to strike. It said, quote, "Scorpions, nature's way of saying, screw you, I'm going to combine lobsters, spiders, wasps, and nightmares," end quote. This division of a scorpion's parts makes a clear, dominant impression, and also illustrates that the breakdown doesn't have to be literal, since obviously nightmares are not an animal. So, what should you do when classifying? First, you should examine the subject from several angles, figuring out a few different ways that it could be subdivided or grouped, paying special attention to similarities and differences. Then, you sort the objects into relevant categories according to shared characteristics. Pick your categories with care, making sure that everything conforms to your principle of selection. Use mutually exclusive categories, so there won't be confusion when trying to decide which category something goes in. You should explain each category or component, and, as always, consider your audience and purpose. Examples are often an essential part of classification, usually being used as multiple illustrations. Closely related to classification is the idea of definition, explaining what something is and isn't. How you define something says something about what you think of it, and more, it can influence people unconsciously. English has lots of words that mean basically the same thing, but carry very different connotations or emotional meanings. Which one you pick is the difference between defining the neighbor's kids as wild, undisciplined hooligans or defining them as rowdy, rambunctious little boys. Often, this word choice has more impact on us than we realize as we soak up the interpretation along with the label or definition. You do have to be careful with definition, however, as there's almost nothing more uselessly boring than when a writer starts an essay with a dictionary definition of a commonly understood word. However, that isn't to say that definition has no utility in writing. Used correctly, definition can be a powerful tool. We've discussed the types of meaning before. The difference between someone who is refined and someone who is snobby can be more a matter of perception than any actual difference. Man's best friend versus a cur or a mutt versus a hound all have very different connotations, even though they are all words for dogs. Definition has several different uses. Of course, the most obvious is that you can use definition to clarify. If you're using a vague, conceptual word like justice or freedom, a definition can clarify what you mean. which part of a complex and multifaceted meaning you're referring to. For example, the ancient Greeks considered freedom very differently than we do. They considered freedom to be the opposite of slavery. Therefore, if you were not a slave, you had freedom, regardless of what tyrannical laws your government might enforce or whether your father chose to have you beaten to death for embarrassing your family. On the other hand, we think of freedom as having two parts, and notice how division here is being used to define and clarify, another indication of the overlap between the patterns. The freedom to do things, speak, assemble, bear arms, etc., and the freedom from things, unjust imprisonment, religious persecution, etc. Which definition you're using makes a big difference. Debates over what constitutes torture were in full force after the September 11, 2001 attacks, when George W. Bush approved harsh interrogation techniques that were banned by President Obama when he took office. Bush's officials issued a memo that argued that what they called enhanced interrogations constitute torture only if they intentionally caused suffering, quote, equivalent in intensity to the pain accompanying serious physical injury, such as organ failure, impairment of bodily function, or even death. The tactics approved included prolonged sleep deprivation, shackling into painful stress positions for long periods while naked and in a cold room, being slammed into a wall, being locked inside a small box, and the suffocation tactic called waterboarding. Anyone who has ever had a newborn baby can attest to the torture that is sleep deprivation, and being cuffed into a horribly painful, twisted position in a freezing room while naked seems indistinguishable from torture by many people. In this case, definitions can make a huge difference. You can also use definition to change a reader's understanding of a word. You might write an essay arguing for or against the idea that family should only include blood relatives and those through marriage, for example. You can also use definition to argue against a change in a word as well, as the author Nicholas Thompson does in an essay called Hero Inflation, about how the word hero has become so overused that it's losing its meaning. The author said that ancient Greek heroes were larger than life. They performed great deeds. He says heroes should be people who transform the world, are incredibly brave or self-sacrificing, and are noble of heart. Plus, they have to succeed. He argues against the idea that the victims of the 9/11 attacks are heroes, or that someone a child admires is a hero, and says that it devalues the true meaning of heroism. You can also use definition as a way to come to a greater understanding of a term as well. Perhaps you merely want your readers to re-examine a term and consider its importance. Education is a word familiar to all, and you've had years of experience with it, but that is not the whole story. Were you to write about the word within the context of your college education, you might begin by chasing down its etymology, which would bring you to the Latin educatus, meaning brought up. From there, you might speculate on how the meaning of education has shifted from conveying general knowledge and developing reason and judgment to emphasizing skills and preparation for a specific profession. At that point, you would have the makings of an argument for or against that change. As another example, consider the term senior citizen. What does senior mean? One definition is more important, experienced, superior, higher rank, especially due to experience, such as in the phrase, a senior officer. What about citizen? A citizen is someone with rights and responsibilities, paying taxes, voting, following the laws. Just with these quick definitions, you can see a shift in how we might think of senior citizens, not just old people, but experienced people who deserve respect and have both rights and responsibilities, just like the rest of us. Definition, perhaps more than any other rhetorical pattern, uses other modes to serve its purpose. Were you to write an essay on honesty, for example, you might begin your discussion with a narrative, a brief story about a friend who bought a magazine at a newsstand and received too much change for a $20 bill. The narrative can then lead to comparison and contrast, making the distinction between honesty and dishonesty. And if the friend kept the money but feels guilty about it, you'd be dealing with cause and effect. Make your reader feel that guilt, and you'll be using description. A definition of grace could cite the example of Michael Jordan's drive to a basket or a cheetah running in the wild. If you were writing a short research paper defining the common cold, comparison would help you distinguish it from the flu, and process analysis would enable you to analyze its progress from the first sore throat to the last sniffle. In between, you might discuss possible ways to relieve symptoms, which would bring in classification. Although you may use many different modes, your primary one would still be definition. Here is one example of the way how we define something can carry value judgment. This meme defines laziness as simply an insulting word for efficiency. As with some of the other patterns, I encourage you to pause the video and try an activity that will give you a chance to put into practice what you've just learned. Pause the video and set a timer for 5 to 10 minutes. Then, write a free write where you don't worry about neatness, spelling, or grammar and just get your ideas out without judgment, defining one or more of the words or phrases given in this list. Think about what the concept is or is not, what it should or should not have, and how we can recognize it. You can also use the other patterns to get ideas. How would you describe it or tell a story about it? What examples could you give? Are there different types it could be classified into? What comparisons could you make? Pause the video and get started. Process analysis is simply breaking a process or action down into its parts. You analyze or describe the process. There are essentially two types of process analyses depending on the purpose. The first type is a directional process analysis. You can think of this as a set of directions for the person to follow. A directional process analysis is used when you expect the person to actually carry out the process. Examples of directional process analyses are things like instruction manuals, cookbooks, or the explanations in my textbook of processes like revision. However, this type is less common in an expository essay. The type of process analysis that you usually get in an essay is an explanatory process analysis, where you explain how a process works or what happened without expecting that the person is going to do the process themselves. For instance, explanations in history class about how World War II started, or an explanation of how photosynthesis works in science class. This type is often used in essays. For example, if you're arguing that chocolate is good for you, contrary to what people think, you could explain the process of how it's digested to show the benefits it has. If you're arguing for laws requiring more humane treatment of animals, you could explain the process of raising a particular animal for slaughter, being ripped away from the mom, being held in a place too small for it, often splattered with waste, being fed sludge before being subjected to an automated death process that doesn't always kill the animal, leaving some buried alive in the corpses of their neighbors. This explanation of the process could be a compelling argument, especially if you use description well. For either type, the format is almost always a series of steps in order. Some of the things that you'll want to do is to separate the process into the necessary steps or parts, describing each in detail. You want them in a logical order so they're easy to follow, with clear transitions to warn a reader when you're moving from one step to the next. One of the most important tips is to consider the trouble spots. What part are readers likely to have trouble understanding or performing? Back in Chapter 3, I had a directional process analysis, which explained how to write pie paragraphs on pages 60 through 62. If you look back at it, you can see that I used these tips. How to write a paragraph was divided into 3 steps: writing the point, writing the information, and writing the explanation. And they were organized in a way that made sense, in this case, from the beginning of the paragraph to the end. And it's obvious which of the 3 elements I'm talking about at any given time. You can see that I spent much more time on the E, or explanation portion, than I did on the other two. I had an entire section called Making Sure You Have Enough E in Your Pie, even though the other two sections of point and information didn't have anything similar. I actually spent more time on that section than the other two combined. This was because I knew that the explanation would be the trouble spot, since it is both the most difficult and the most unfamiliar to most students. Finally, you want to make sure that your thesis or topic sentence not only mentions the process you'll be analyzing, but makes some sort of point or argument. Don't forget that you're writing an expository essay, and stay focused on the argument. When you're writing a process analysis, one of the most important things to do is to prepare. First, study the process, brainstorming or researching steps, and making sure you understand both the steps or parts as well as how they fit together or what the sequence is. In addition, you want to make sure to consider what your audience does and doesn't know. You don't want to bore them with details about something they already know, but you want to make sure that unfamiliar parts are made clear. Again, consider my pie process analysis from the paragraphing chapter as an example of tailoring an explanation to your audience. While process analysis can sound somewhat confusing, it is really very simple. An explanation of a process. This doesn't sound very interesting or useful in an essay, but it really can be. For example, if you're trying to prove that cheerleading is a sport and deserves more respect than it gets, you might explain the process of training and practicing and how much time, dedication, and athletic skill that it takes. Cause and effect analysis is the method of dividing occurrences into their elements to find relationships among them. Cause and effect is commonly used, but it can be more complex than it might seem at first glance. For example, nearly anything in life is both an effect of things and a cause of other things, creating a cause and effect chain of linked phenomena, where one cause creates an effect that causes something else. There are several aspects to identifying cause and effect relationships that can make them a bit more challenging and complex than they might seem on the surface. One is that in real life, there are usually multiple causes for any effect and multiple effects for every cause, though usually they are not all of equal importance. For example, you're taking this English course at Santa Rosa Junior College, which is an effect of needing the class for a degree and a cause of better understanding of reading and writing concepts. There are multiple reasons you're here, ranging from your primary reason, you need the class to graduate or transfer, to secondary reasons. This class fit into your schedule, the reasons you chose to do it this semester instead of another, you heard the teacher was awesome, and so on. Cause and effect aren't inherent. They are relational, so whether something is a cause or an effect depends on what you're looking at. Your dog vomiting is an effect of eating grass, but a cause of him being kicked out of the house. Again, in real life, a single cause generates many effects, and one effect is the result of multiple causes. For instance, smoking can cause heart disease, lung cancer, and emphysema, or heart disease may be caused by smoking, obesity, and genetics. In addition, smoking can be a contributing factor in an individual with all three diseases, or an individual with heart disease may smoke or be obese or have a family history of heart disease. You can also see this in the children's book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, where the protagonist gives a mouse a cookie, which causes the mouse to get thirsty and need milk, which causes him to get a mustache, which causes him to look in the mirror to get it off, which causes him to realize he needs a haircut, and so on and so forth. The entire book is one big cause and effect chain. Causes and effects usually occur in a sequence known as a causal chain, like the one I just explained. As another example, smoking can cause emphysema, which causes a person to slow down, which leads to weight gain, resulting in heart disease. Identifying a causal chain requires sorting out events in time as either immediate or remote, and identifying their relative importance in the sequence as primary or secondary. Immediate causes happen nearest an event, while remote ones happen farther away in time. Primary causes are directly and primarily responsible for the outcome, such as needing this class for a degree as a cause for taking it, whereas secondary causes merely contribute to the outcome, such as you're not taking a face-to-face class and this online section having open seats. Related events sometimes overlap, sometimes follow one another immediately, and sometimes connect over gaps in time. They vary in their duration, complexity, and importance. Analyzing cause and effects thus requires not only identifying them, but also discerning the relationships accurately and weighing their significance fairly. It's all too easy to make a mistake in identifying the relationships. One of the most common is mistaking time order for cause and effect. There's a logical fallacy usually presented in Latin, post hoc ergo propter hoc, meaning after this, therefore because of this. The fact that it is a fallacy is a pretty strong clue that it's not going to stand up to scrutiny. In the textbook, I gave the example that just because you ate a cupcake before getting an A on a test doesn't mean the cupcake caused the A. It probably has more to do with the amount of studying, your attendance in class, and so on. However, this type of error isn't always as obviously ridiculous. Just because a big box store moves into town and then later a smaller store closes its doors doesn't automatically make them connected. It may be that the owners of the smaller store were elderly and were planning to close down at that time anyway. Don't assume. As another example, there's an old joke that goes something like this. A guy walks into a bar, sits down and orders a beer. As he waits for his beer, he claps his hands together again and again, loudly and insistently. Annoyed, the bartender asks, "Hey pal, what's up with the hand clapping?" And the guy says, "It scares the elephants away." "But," says the bartender, "there aren't any elephants around here." And the guy replies, "See, it's working." Just because clapping happened first and a lack of elephants happened after doesn't mean they're cause and effect. Also, keep in mind not to fall into the trap of oversimplifying when considering causes. It's nearly cliché to say that the Civil War was fought to free the slaves of the American South, but it is also far from the whole truth. There were monumental economic and political causes behind that war, and without those other causes, there might not have been a war at all. One of the biggest issues wasn't the issue of slavery per se, but rather the issue of how much control the central government should have over the states. The South wanted to become its own country. The North didn't want to lose control over it. As I mentioned a moment ago, it's a logical fallacy to assume that because things happen together, one is the cause of the other. Correlation is not causation. For example, sometimes people talk about the increasing violence in music, television, and other forms of entertainment as being a cause of increased violence in real life, such as the school shootings. However, it's more likely that the increase of violence in both entertainment and real life are effects of changes in society, the economy, or other root causes. Both are effects rather than being direct cause and effect. Cause and effect have many uses. They can be used to predict events, determine consequences, assign responsibility, and even make plans. Remember, the patterns of development have three main uses. They're great for brainstorming support material, particularly if you use the questions for brainstorming that I included with each in the chapter. They can help you come up with more material to make your papers longer and stronger, and awareness of the patterns can help you analyze the writing of others. Also, there were certain themes that came up in all of the pattern usage guides, such as keeping your purpose in mind, being selective and concise, and considering your audience. I hope that the discussions and information contained in this video and the textbook chapter were useful and helpful, and that you now have a better idea about how you can use the various patterns of development to develop your writing and to evaluate the writing of others. Thank you for joining me in this discussion of the 8 main patterns of development. Please don't hesitate to contact me with any questions you may have about the material. I'm always happy to help. And as always, there's more information in the description box below.